Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon, firstly, and welcome everyone to the third of the May Day Textile Elements, a series of conversations, and today's pattern with Marcia Bennett-Male and Jessica Ogden. Our session's chaired by Amy Holroyd and me, Carol Tulloch. And if some of you have attended our first two sessions, bear with us as we present information for those who are attending for the first time today. The event is also part of the UAL research season, which ends this month. Before we continue, we could have I'll just remind you of housekeeping. So if you feel comfortable, include your pronouns in brackets after your name. Please keep your video switched off. Please keep your audio on mute. Post any questions in the chat. There's live transcription option is available. And the event is being recorded in accordance with UAL virtual event privacy notice. And there will be, and these recorded sessions will be made available on YouTube at a later date. Thanks, Elise. So firstly, Amy and I would like to introduce ourselves and give a biography. So I am Professor of Dress, Diaspora and Transnationalism at the University of the Arts, based at London College of Fashion, London, based at Chelsea College of Arts. Come on, Carol. And I'm also a honorary senior research fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum. My research it focuses on difference, being, belonging, making the self, style narratives, and style activism. And these have been explored in my monograph, The Birth of Cool Style Narratives of the African Diaspora. My stitch textiles and making is related research includes the contributory chapter, There's No Place Like Home, a home dressmaking and creativity in the Jamaican community of the 1940s to the 1960s. And the exhibition Handmade Tales, Women in Domestic Crafts. I'm also interested in the possibilities of conversation, as in this series, that includes curatorial conversation, as is explored in the exhibition Jessica Ogden Still. Amy.
Carol, so I'm Amy. I'm Associate Professor of Fashion and Sustainability in the School of Art and Design at Nottingham Trent University. I lead research projects at the intersection of fashion, making, design and sustainability. My background is in fashion and knitwear design and making. At the moment, I'm focusing on my Arts and Humanities Research Council funded fellowship project, which is Fashion Fictions. And in the project, I bring people together to generate experience and reflect on engaging fictional visions of alternative fashion cultures and systems. And I'll also mention the network that I lead with Emma Shercliffe, Stitching Together, which is a network that fosters critical dialogue around participatory textile making in research and practice. Okay, back to you, Carol.
Thank you, Amy. So before we continue and have our conversation with Jessica and Marcia, I'll just talk about the origins of the idea for the series of conversations and how it developed. So May-Day Textile Elements, a series of conversations, is the first event under the Chelsea Camberwell Wimbledon Design School Initiative, Making Design Agency, May-Day, and part of the Design Schools Conference Series. May-Day began as an idea I proposed as a space where members of staff of the different courses at the CC Design School could develop thinking and practice on past, present or future relationships of making, design and the self. Individualized making is at the core of May-Day, to quote Ved Amit and Noel Dyke in Claiming Individuality, the Cultural Politics of Distinction, the expression of individuality as a form of social action inextricably linked to questions of belonging. I'm also interested in how this can contribute to social cultural engagement, whether local, national or transnational. I decided on a smaller initial step to focus on stitching. It is it is a practice I have relied on since my teens, but in the last few years has become increasingly significant. For example, in 2019, an invitation from Sequoia Barnes to hand stitch a quilt while two Black women talk as a performance piece at the Fruit Market Gallery, Edinburgh. Morning stitching as a form of centering of the day, and intuitive stitching work I showed to Matthew Harris at our first mentoring session in June 2020. I founded the Making Time group in November 2020 with 7 members of CCW staff. We meet on Tuesday evenings to make whatever we feel the need to do. I often just stitch, and attending 2 Claire Wellesley-Smith online courses in 2021 demonstrated the power of daily stitching. And then writing about the sewing machine as agency for women who designed and made outfits for the women of the dance hall in Jamaica, in Akeem Smith No Gal Contest, or exploring pattern as practice and the day-to-day repetition of practices and patterns of patterns that enable individuals to bear the complexities of living in my essay contribution, Epiphanies of Dress, to the Labena exhibition catalogue that came out last year, 2020, through which I first came across What is Pattern by Suatsu Yanagi, published in 1932. And so armed with all this and more, I invited Amy to co-develop the project. We decided to go back to the basics to consider some of the elements associated with stitching through conversations. So MAI-Day Textile Elements, a series of conversations, is a space where practitioners can collectively explore connections and disconnections that in turn could inform new thinking through making directions. The Textile Elements Conversation series brings together pairs of practitioners from different aspects of stitch making and related craft art practice to share their thoughts about 3 fundamental aspects of stitch practice, but abstract terms: plain sewing, piecing, and pattern. These are all familiar aspects of stitch practice, but what do they mean for practitioners who explore them from different perspectives? Amy and I would like to thank Polly Leonard of Salvage Magazine for joining us as a partner. Amy.
Okay, thanks, Carol. So as we developed our plans for these conversations, we felt it would be useful to have some shared reference points that we could discuss. So for each theme, we've selected a number of very short text extracts from a variety of sources, which our speakers are sometimes making reference to as the conversation unfolds, as they wish to or not. It's a kind of an open resource. So you can find these on a Padlet, which Elise has just pasted into the chat for us. So do click through and you'll see there's a column on each of the themes. So we're in the pattern column today, and you'll see the texts that we shared with the speakers in advance. In a moment, I'll introduce them and pose a first question to get things going. But first, just to explain a little about the format of the session, we're going to let the conversation run, mainly between Jessica and Marcia, but perhaps with some occasional interjections from Carol or me for an hour or so up until about 4 o'clock. And then for the last half an hour, we'd like to open up the conversation to questions from you all. And at that point, we'll ask you to post your questions in the chat. I mean, you could post them in as they occur to you while Jessica and Marcia are talking, if you like, and then we'll ask them on your behalf. So finally, to introduce our 2 speakers. So first, Marcia Bennett-Male. Marcia's textile pieces are art therapy for her. They look at how she navigates through the world as a Black female. They depict Black women from history, previously poorly documented, and they celebrate fantastical goddesses of myth and legend. Her original influences were the embroidered flags of, am I saying this right, Marcia, if I say Fante?
Infante, right? Yes, Fante.
People, thank you. Looking at their style and execution gave her permission to relax from her formal embroidery training. It was also the fearless and visceral paintings of Frida Kahlo which enabled her to work on an autobiographical level. Welcome, Marcia.
Thank you.
And Jessica. The designer artist Jessica Ogden has been an influential fashion textiles and homewares designer since 1993 I'm sure I remember putting in pictures of your work in my student sketchbooks, Jessica, which was more than 20 years ago.
I know.
Her aesthetic is undeniably personal, and for this reason resonates on an emotive level. Her magpie style of appropriation can include the colours from her native Jamaica on the one hand, or American quilting techniques on the other, juxtaposed with traditional utilitarian workwear shapes. Jessica's life and career spans continents and contributes to her unique style, epitomised most notably in her long-term collaborative relationship with French clothing brand APC since 2001. So welcome, Jessica, welcome both of you. We're so pleased to have you here. Let's get started with a first question. So when we initially invited you, can you recall what your first thought was about this theme of pattern? How do you interpret the term? And having had a bit of time to think about it, how does your work relate to the theme? So if I go to Marcia first.
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, Carol and Amy, for inviting me to the talk. And before I forget, I'd like to thank Elise, who's in the background, so I'll probably forget. Thank you very much for doing all this, all the preparation work and admin. For me, that first question, my automatic response was, I did, you know, that word association thing kicked in straight away. So you say pattern, and my brain said colourful. Then it went to gaudy, and then it went to clashing. You know, I also thought, you know, oh, you know, what are they asking me for? You know, why? But then I realised, you know, the first piece, one of my textile pieces immediately jumped into my head, which was, I think you're using it for the promo, English Rose. So that piece jumped into my head. I said, oh, okay, you know, that must be, that's a kicking off point for that. So, so my initial thoughts were, you know, as I say, very exuberant colours, clashing, what have you. But I realised on reflection later on, because one of your questions does say, you know, thinking about the question, mulling it over, what do you think? I realised that for me, pattern, because I'm also a stone carver, I earn my living as a stone carver. I use a lot of pattern, and I use it. I use predominantly sort of monochrome stone. It's either black or it's either white, you know, or off, you know. But I do a lot of embossing. It's like embossed fabric. I've done embossed stone, so I will do. I will use the shadow, the carving marks, to make patterns within the stone. And I realized I do a lot of feathers, you know, a mass of feathers or a mass of curls, or I love scales. I don't know what's about me and scales, don't ask me. But en masse, that lovely, calming, repetitive pattern, but that's in my stone. But with pattern, with my fabric, it's, I think maybe because I am working with this monochrome material more or less 9 to 5, my regular working day. The pattern and the clashing of how I use it, it's just really, it's a refreshment for the eyes. Yeah, it's like, I haven't had an opal fruit for ages, you know, but it's, you know, that really lovely zingy flavour in your mouth, but it's for the eyes. That's how I use it anyway. So I don't know. What about you, Jessica?
A great mental picture, yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Well, yes, well, first of all, thank you again for having me. And yes, I definitely agree. Everything going on behind the scenes, thank you. So Carol and I have been having conversations for a little while now. And so when she brought up this idea of pattern, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense somehow. But I guess I never really put it into that word. So it was kind of like, then I was just looking, back at all of my work and why did Carol think of me? And, in some ways it's very, very obvious just because of the work I do with patchwork quilts. But then it was also just trying to go back to like where the obsession started. And I guess that's a good place for me to maybe introduce, like how this world developed, in why it works for me or why I'm obsessive about it. And I think it's, like the first touch into pattern was, finding these beautiful antique quilts. And I would always kind of pick up the worst ones, which, the quilt dealers loved because they really were the ones to throw away, and starting to mend those and remake those into what was at that point my ready-to-wear label one-off pieces. And just seeing the beauty of, not just the layers of, not just the pattern on the surface, but then once it was being destroyed, you saw the mending underneath, and that, created a whole new level of pattern. And, it also made me think of, where some of my inspiration comes from, which could be as in nature, the patterns that nature gives us. So the formation of rock, or, the clouds in the sky, and trying to kind of break that down. So then from these antique quilts, starting to develop my own patchwork, which, like was also then to do with print as well. We would lay a print on top of one another in the studio. So like I had, like the practice was, stitch, print, then pattern of actual clothes. It made me think of as well, that we work with, I worked with pattern cutters and what, so I guess, my mind was in two minds. One was about surface pattern, one was actually, like construction pattern. And then I was also like just recently, so I do the APC quilts, which is very much about, it's a sustainable project in that it's the offcuts of their production that I then work with. So it's a very mathematical process that I'm doing. But then, I guess each stage of my work, like now it's about watercolors, and just, even though they're very, I guess, intricate, it's trying to be free with myself with that. Sewing obviously is a longer process, and with the watercolors, the your imagination is able to just go, and where does it, it's just more kind of instant. So yes, I mean, it's just, I surround my life with it. I think there's something about that you kind of touched on, Marcia, which is, rules to be broken, that we, well, for me, it was like you're taught that you shouldn't wear cream with white, or, these kinds of things, or you shouldn't clash your patterns, or you shouldn't, these were, things you kind of, I mean, I definitely remember growing up here that, there were rules. And for sure, those, I love the fact that I was able to, break those, because that's what gives us like, inspires to kind of go like, of course it works. And when I see your work and, like what you're doing, the layers of all of these patterns, it does really, I can understand why they put us into a conversation, because it's, like there are no rules. It's what, it's come from either your development of your own work, research, but also just feeling, like that's, I guess, how I look at my work. It's feeling, like really just, okay, I can put these things together because I feel them to be correct together.
Now, when I was reading up on your work, there was several comments regarding you used the terms reflect and project history and personal historical conversations, which I liked. That was I really sort of got hold of that. You use beautiful old antique quilts. I've got. I tend to go to car boot sales or charity shops, and I've got curtains, and I've got a lovely. It looks like it's from the 1940s, but it was just reproduced from as a John Lewis thing, but it looks good anyway. Tablecloths, which have been very, very useful. But say I've got in the car a whole pile of old curtains knock in the back of my car, mixed up with stone dust at the moment. But but yes, it's and I've also used some fabric because my mother was a dressmaker. So I've raided her. She no longer sews, unfortunately. She's got dementia, but I've raided her stockpile of fabrics. So there was a particular curtain fabric she had, and she still had leftovers. So I just grabbed hold of those, and so they've been very useful. And I tend to use personally, I tend to use, not all the time, I will use a particular type of background to reflect that subject matter that I'm working on. There is one textile called Left to Her Own Devices, where it's me as a little girl, in the middle of the road. But I've deliberately used this domestic tablecloth, because the tablecloth has got printed on it pots and pans and teacups and coffee cups and things like that. So it's clearly, very a domestic setting. So I've used that, but the curtains, the chintz curtains I use for my background, again, I tend to use those. I use them as a shorthand personally. I've got two types of fabric I tend to use predominantly. It's the chintz, and then there is the Dutch wax fabric, otherwise known as the African fabric. Yeah. I use the Dutch fabric as a shorthand for being Black. Initially, I didn't want to use it. I felt because it was classed as an African fabric, I thought I was being a bit of a fraud using it, because I see myself, I'm obviously African background, but I'm predominantly Caribbean, so I felt a fraud using the African fabric. But there was nothing, I couldn't find anything which said Caribbean, so I went to that as a shorthand. So the African fabric is a shorthand for Blackness. The chintz is a shorthand for my English background, where I live. So I use it as a background, and I also use it as a little, within a lot of my textiles, I have a little hillock that the figure is standing on, and the little hillock is England. So that little hillock, a little bit of terra firma, is England. It's where I live. That's where I reside, and it's where I navigate my world. So, but I also have used chopped up bits of the Union Jack, as well, again, to really nail home the fact that I'm in England.
Yeah.
So, but I really sort of thought, oh yes, that's what I do when I was reading about you. But you use beautiful antique quilt.
I do try, and I mean, there's a big conversation about cutting into quilts, and that is definitely something, back in the day, because I no longer am in that kind of making process. It really was important to me that this was something that was not a prize quilt, just to make sure that it's like it needed love to bring it back to a new life, rather than a pristine quilt that you just kind of chopped into. And that's really what started the studio, myself in the studio, making our own, is like in some ways, like maybe that's how we all learn, which is sometimes kind of like we see something and we want to do it ourselves. So it was like, okay, let's make this in-house. And then that was like the beginning of like when you start to make your own patchwork rather than like just finding it and using it. Then that's a whole other language that's going on. Which obviously, has brought me full circle to actually now making quilts, like, so it's almost like it was like finding the quilts, then making patchworks, which were more like for garments, and then now drawing and making quilts, but, like still not all of them, but, with this idea of sustainability behind it, which is, the offcuts of this fashion company's production. So, like it's almost like I feel kind of gone full circle into like what, I was just finding to actually now producing that. And I love it. It's like I can't think of a better way to spend my time than drawing and imagining these quilts, and pushing myself into what like how far can I push myself into an abstract form that is making sense to me, and then also it's something very structured as well, because it does have to be communicated to a workshop, so there is a very technical side to it as well, which I'm like I know with your embroidery work you do yourself, but I mean your stonework, but I imagine the technical side of your stonework must be like pretty incredible, because that's like you need to know if it's going to break, or when you make those very small surface, I just full of admiration.
When you were talking about not being scared or being nervous of cutting into these antique quilts, I immediately thought of, because I tend to with my own personal stone carving pieces, I do a lot of recycling of stone. Mm-hmm. I've got over the years, I've gotten pieces from buildings that have been torn down. And I tend to like to keep. It's harder and harder to get hold of that kind of stone now, but I used to keep elements of the original carving in the stone, and I added my own. So, but it was. Yes, I had these historical, very old bits of stone from churches, and one was a listed building which shouldn't have come down, but being bold enough just to carve into it. But I also wanted to ask you. I know we've had a previous talk before where I think you said you weren't keen on letting light in on magic, but your watercolors, how are you going from your watercolors now to your textiles? Because I tend to work my initial drawings, I mean, if people want to go onto my Instagram page, they'll see I sometimes post up that first drawing that I'm going to start with, and it's very, very. I do obviously, trained as I do a very sketchy, little. But with my textile drawings, I go from the sketchy doodle, if you like, literally on the back of an envelope sometimes, to very sharp, linear, cold drawing.
Yeah.
I don't know how do you go from your watercolor to your textile? Have you?
I've switched, like I switch it up in some ways for myself, because I do want to kind of, let's say, make a challenge for myself each time. It's not just, okay, here's a new round to draw. It's so at one of the rounds was actually to do with doing the watercolors first, and then like from my selection of fabrics, which is, it's getting less because we are using up the the remains. So not thinking of the fabrics at all at that point and doing the watercolors, and then it's almost like, I guess, you work with like, okay, that has the feeling of that blue, and then I start, it's a little bit paint by numbers, but then your own world of paint by numbers, and what I love is the fact that I'm not trying to do it on a computer to see it before it's made in the workshop. So basically my technical drawings are sent across to a very small workshop in India, and I love that surprise, that of basically like, okay, I've had to see it to, and did I see it correctly? Did I make that feeling happen between the two? And I think when you talked about not wanting to let the magic out, I think what it is more that like maybe it's just a way of working where I'm very obsessed with process. I think, like everyone here is, and it's maybe just being kind of, like shy to it, or, like just kind of wanting, it's like, have I done it right? So I'll know if I've done it right by the end of the piece. So then, like I just switch up the way I do it every time. So this last round I've worked with the sky and breaking down the different formations of clouds into a geometric form. Okay. And then just trying to push because, I think what maybe is useful for us to, or me to say, is that I don't have a choice in the fabrics, like what I'm, like I have this, set of fabrics, but I didn't go to a shop and get them. They were given to me. I have the choice in what I use on one quilt within that group. But, like when I've done quilts where I actually, like we did a red and white round, that was, okay, I chose those fabrics. But so sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't like this fabric. What am I going to do with it? But, it's like just having to like, okay, let's push it. And so, yeah, it's kind of like my pot is like only so big, but I quite like all those, like boundaries that then you just have to push, like, okay, so I do change every round how I approach it, just to kind of also allow myself like that freedom, that it doesn't have to be, okay, I'll start with the watercolor, then do that. I'm now doing watercolors back into old quilt designs kind of thing.
No, you mentioned the paint by numbers thing, because as I said, that my final working drawings are very linear, very, very sort of clean, graphic, hard. Yeah. And I have my drawing, and I then yes, decide. I get my box of fabrics out. I've got, I live in a tiny flat, but we've managed to get boxes underneath the bed of fabric. And then I decide what section, well, first of all, I decide on, I think, on the background, what do I want to portray? Because sometimes the backgrounds are just plain. Or I've got a yellow and white stripe that I sometimes use. That was some old bedding that my mum had. But in terms of the painting by numbers, I will then go and decide, okay, what I want pattern and what I want plain, and what pattern can I put next to another pattern so that they pop, so they work. Sometimes I want them to. I used to be a lot more cavalier with my choice of pattern. I think I'm beginning to sort of rein myself in a little bit. I should stop that, because there is a lot of thought about how that particular shade of African fabric, if you like, works along that shade of a little bit of chintz. But I work it all out. I work out what bits I want pattern, what bits I want plain, but then I go to the boxes of fabric and then select.
Exactly.
And then that's it turns into a completely different beast. So I'm sometimes surprised at the end. Oh, blimey! What I've come up with, because yes, I've made choices. That's going, but I don't know what pattern is going to go there at the very when I first start drawing. So
do you ever undo like a finished piece if you're not happy, or do you, like, you've gone with that decision and you hold to it, or do you go back in at a later date kind of going
No, if but how I work the textiles, what I have done with one or two, I've added, but I can't take away.
Right.
So if a piece, I have had one or two pieces which don't work, and I can see them in my mind now, and I would like to redo them, just completely redo them, because yes, I can't, not that I can't, I just don't unpick. If it's wrong, it's wrong. The chance, my experiment, my chance didn't work.
No, I ask that because sometimes when I do get back the quilt, like I can, it's definitely like, it's, my language has gotten better, because now, I guess I've been doing the quilts for 10 years at least, something like that. So, but every now and again, that surprise of like, oh no, that didn't work. And, I will actually, every now and again, just go back in and rethink how it is. And I guess that was, it's something that, as much as we are saying that, there's a kind of, I mean, we're definitely choosing, but it isn't random. It is very, very precise, even if to the viewer, it's like, well, how did that come out? That, and knowing when something's wrong,
No, I know what you mean. So my pieces look, they look simplistic, but as I already said, there's a lot of choice. It's the real, it's also the real, one of the real fun parts is, getting all the boxes out, getting the iron board up, getting the iron out, and then, picking, and then I'll tell my husband, no, leave me alone, I'm picking fabric. I'm picking fabric. I need focus, and then seeing, and then taking a chunk of that and a chunk of this, and then what I will do is for one particular area, I might select 3 different types of fabric, pattern, or what have you, for that particular section. And I haven't decided which one works yet. So sometimes I might, you know, I tend to, after my drawing, so I'm jumping ahead a bit, after my initial drawing, I will do a working tracing, where I will then from that working tracing, I will do a series of little templates, out of tracing paper. So I will cut several pieces for that section with my template for that, and see which one works. Usually, you know, not often, but you know, it's not unheard of. So as I say, I've used the term pop. What pops and can be, you know, seen from a distance, next to each other. So I used to be a lot more, say, cavalier, but I'm reining it in, and there's a lot more thought and care that goes into it. I wanted to say earlier on, because one of the first talk that Carol and Amy had was in regards to plain stitch, the term plain stitch, and I thought, oh, maybe I was more relevant for that, because I tend to only use, because the stitching is very much a part of the colour and the clashing. So I deliberately use random bits of thread that I've got, embroidery thread, but I tend to stick to maybe 5 stitches. Again, even though I did do a formal O and A level embroidery, did ecclesiastical embroidery, and did theatre wardrobe and what have you. It slows me down too much. My very first piece in 2004, in terms of art therapy in the embroidery, was this piece in I've forgotten the name. Anyway, I've forgotten the name of the stitch, but it was all hand stitched, beautifully done. Yeah, of course, beautifully done.
You're proud.
It just, I couldn't imagine doing that now. It just takes too long. I just have to get the image out as quickly as possible.
It's funny because people always ask me if I make the quilts, actually make them, and it's like, no, how could I produce that amount of work? Because stitching,
you work on a huge scale, yes.
And in fact, it's like as much, it's like the stitching side of it, or my stitch work now, is very personal. To make my own clothes, or to like just something that's not to do, let's say, with that side of the work. It's just, like for me, the drawing side is really what drives the patchwork. But I can see, like in your work, the stitch is as relevant, or, it's that other layer on top. But yeah.
No, with the drawing, I tend to, as I say, I think what I said, ideas will come to me from any source, and I will just do initially a quick doodle, back of an envelope, a notepad in the kitchen, what have you. But then it's the drawing up, and I tend to, sometimes the ideas come thick and fast. I listen to a lot of music when I'm carving, and so sometimes a line in a song can, and I've got to grab a piece of paper. Sometimes I'm soaking in the bathtub. I have to keep a notepad by the bathtub for me now. It's otherwise, it's getting out. Just because if I don't get out the bathtub to put that drawing down, it's going to go. So, but yes, the initial drawings are very important. And I will, if the ideas are coming thick and fast, I will have one drawing leapfrog over another one. This one, I think, oh, this one I've got to do. But then something else comes along that I think, oh, Jesus, I've got to see this. So that idea can leapfrog over two other. So, and I do, it's very soothing as well, getting the idea from initial squiggle down to this linear drawing, this very hard lined graphic, and then, as I said earlier, to see this black and white cold drawing turn into this, I say I'm still surprised myself, this colorful, bright, piece. It turns into a completely different animal. So
but also, like, looking at one thing that, I mean, I don't know if it does with you, but you were talking about, them leapfrogging over one another. But when I see your Instagram, because, if you look at the grid of them, instead of, one by one, and you just start to see this, yes, they're all playing with one another. And it's like, it's not anymore like the singular character, but, like it's something that I actually used at a certain point for design, which was like, instead of, when we were talking about pattern on pattern, that it's like, if I took a screenshot of, 9 quilts, and that became the design starting point for a new quilt. So if it's something so there was a photograph of Jean Tuitu and we did a series of quilts for anthropology. And when they arrived, we placed them on the studio floor in Paris. You can see from above down. And that became, for me, a design, because it was like, okay, that corner is all zigzags. That one was, let's say, square. And then, so it's like, it expanded. It was then 9 quilts in one quilt. Oh, right. It's like, let's really, really push this. So just, when I see your Instagram, I love, like, also like how they relate to one another, like next to one another. That becomes a whole other conversation.
I tend to use, and as you see it, as anybody looks, I should, I say I shouldn't, there's no should, how you use Instagram.
Break those rules.
Stop giving myself rules. But it is, I tend to use Instagram as a way of documenting what I've done and what I'm doing. And it has been very helpful, because I have gone back many times to look at work, not just with my textile, but with my stone page as well. They're both very useful. So, and as I think I said, when we were initially having that talk with Amy and Carol, initially when we first started this, that I tend to use Instagram for people who aren't textile artists. I'm talking to or posting for people who don't do it, or who are curious about the process, especially with my stone carving. With the textile, I feel the only reason why I don't call myself a textile artist, because I feel like I'd feel a fraud, because I'm an artist who works in textiles. Yes, my feet are firmly. So I started off in textiles and embroidery, but because it's
I think everyone here.
I don't earn a living, because I don't earn a living from it. I earn a living from my carving, my stone carving, and I've gone back to. I left the fold, and I've come back to textiles, maybe because I use say very limited stitches, because I've got lots of books now on textile artists, contemporary textile artists, and beautiful, beautiful work. But I think, oh gosh, you know, I don't do that. That's not me. And say, looking at your work, I'm thinking, oh, bloody hell, Jesus Christ. you know.
Well, we disagree. So,
so I'm an artist who works in textiles, but I use Instagram to just let people know how this particular artist goes about her process, or my process of working. Just you know, just out of people who just might swipe just out of sheer curiosity. But that's, you know, that's how I like people to see the drawing, and that, you know, work in I definitely should do the work in progress, that side of things. That's what I like to see. So
right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Maybe I should take a leaf out of your book.
No. So I'm definitely I understand, say, keeping some of the process to yourself, because it's personal. I understand that fully. I just don't do it.
Yeah.
Who cares? So anyway.
I also wanted to say that, like, another thing that when just going back to that initial question about pattern, like something that I touched on in some of the rounds of quilts, but it's something that really has stuck with me, is that in Jamaica, and there's something Carol and I have talked about, we have patchwork houses and we definitely have patchwork roads. And it's something that, you know, the more you know, just driving down the street, and the way that houses, you know, let's say it could be just a roadside shop, how those are painted, there's like a huge, that was one of my inspirations for around. You know, just that kind of, you know, the paint finish over there. So what I think is more of an art to it than that. But you know, sometimes those are decisions. Yes, that color's finished, so let's put on, you know, or the paint before was slightly faded from the sun, but we want to freshen up, but then you know, you only got to half of it. Or very deliberate, you know, like reds and blue door, or, you know, so that's something I know, like for me, is part of, you know, where I grew up with, you know, that sense of color, or, you know, definitely mending, you know, like putting a patch on something is also part of that language.
No, unfortunately, I've never, I haven't had a chance to go back home as yet. So, but seeing, you know, photographs of Jamaica and documentaries, I can, yes, straight away I can see how the patchworkness of the actual structure, as well as the colours, will work. Yeah, and even say, I mean, you can get this across over many countries, but that's just the from, you know, aerial views of landscapes, of fields here, and a forest, you know, forest grove there, and a wood. Yeah. So yes, I am. I will go home soon.
Do you have any questions, Carol or Amy? For us?
I don't know. I've just taken so much of what you're saying, because I kind of got a list here. And I was just thinking, when Jessica, you referred to our conversations in Jamaica and with the patchwork and patching. And I remember us driving around and seeing the buildings, which are Akeem Smith has now lifted most of those and put them into an exhibition within an exhibition space to talk about women of the dance hall. But it fitted with that zinginess of color that Marcia talked about, because there was the heat as well, because you were driving and I could cool down a bit with the windows open, but the heat and then the images kind of combined. So there was that. Then there was the thing of, and I don't know if you want to expand on that, and also with that about, and a little bit what Marcia just meant, I love that thing of using the hills or the hillock as a place to define your place, but also for you, Jessica, a place is very important. And, you know, we went to the markets together and, you know, I saw the women that kind of inspired your aprons and all that, we went together. But also the thing of the hidden pattern, which I thought was something that you both raised. So Jessica was talking about the hidden pattern within the layers of the quilts when you started cutting into them. But I was thinking about sort of for you, Marcia, that you started off your textile practice and working with pattern as something that you did as a private, personal thing first, as a sculpture. So there's two different approaches to coming to pattern as a kind of, not hidden, but yes, hidden, but in a different, do you know what I mean, as a personal space to explore. And both of you are exploring, I suppose.
The textiles, yes, because you know, back in 2004, that's when I first started with using it as art therapy. I started stone carving. I'd already been stone carving, but yes, the sort of, yes, I've only just started in terms of opening up my textiles to the viewers, to the Joe public, literally just, you know, maybe last year. I've got now, this year, I've got, I think, 4 venues. So I'm very nervous about that. So, you know, 4 exhibitions online, but going on the horizon. But it's still very much a private, is it private? Yeah, that's still very much a private practice when I'm doing it, when I need to do it. For example, you know, because I was nervous about doing this talk, I had to grab a few minutes and I was just sewing just to calm me down, you know, just to pull myself off the ledge, so to speak. You know, I'll do some textiles, you know, to calm myself down. So, but the same with the stone. Well, the stone is a different matter, I suppose. It's work. It's work. I earn a living from it. It's, you know, almost 9 to 5. And sometimes I'm working in somebody else's workshop, you know, because we all working, you know, you're all freelancers gathered together, or sometimes I'm on site, but so not so much that, but yes, the textiles are calming and soothing and private, but they are now, I just felt that it was time to put my, I think I might have used the term with you, Carol, put my head above the parapet. And I felt that some of them needed to be seen. So I'm not a veteran, you know, in terms of, you know, like you, Jessica, you know, you've been exhibiting and doing it for donkey's years, you know. I'm still, that's why I don't think I'm a textile artist. I'm an artist who works in textiles, so I don't, you know, because I haven't exhibited them very much.
I guess it was when, it sounds like when I first started making clothes, and, you know, for everybody else, I was a designer, but, you know, like I felt so kind of like, I didn't, because I went through art school and started making from just knowing how to sew as a child, mum teaching me, and my third year, my last year of art school, just completely turning a corner. Oxfam had invited, well, they'd opened up these, basements with all these fabrics, and you just kind of jumped in. And I think my tutors were very much like, okay, so completely turned, and then, started making, it's interesting because with that Oxfam project, that again wasn't about choice. It was what, rolls of fabric people had donated, or, and we, a group of us, and I'm still friends with some of those people. A group of us were just down in the basement making this stuff for a shop. I think it was Marylebone High Street, the Oxfam that used to be there. And so that was all the very start of it, of, like, okay, I'm back in sewing. And then when I had my own label, that idea of like, I'm a designer just was kind of crazy, because I was like, I have no training. But then it's now again turned full circle, where I'm no longer just making. I'm, very much about some things are only design, rather than, actually having my making side coming through. But I'm going to just say that we call you a textile artist, and I'm very happy that you are exhibiting now, because I mean they really are works of art, and they want to go out in the world and play.
How do you feel? I don't know. This isn't really on. As a textile artist, do you feel that textiles are now beginning to be viewed alongside, say, painting, being valued as much as, because there is definitely that the boundaries have blurred between art and craft now, because as a sculptor, I never thought, although I trained as a craftsman in stone. I'm a craftsman in terms of stone carving, but it crossed over. So I never thought of myself as one or the other, but there was always this snobbery, this hierarchy. So do you feel, as a textile artist, that now, or you've always felt that your work has been valued as much as, a painter's work?
I think, there's definitely been changes, and I think I can't remember if it was a conversation in this forum that I remember about the Royal Academy had a rule which was like, no needlework.
Yes, I heard about that. Yeah.
And but then it's, like now we have like the I think mainly in the American sphere rather than in European countries, where the quilts, the art of quilts has definitely been far more recognized than it has ever been, and their value is going for, like, I guess monetary value is being put to them, in that they are in museums, they are in auctions, they are commanding a price, let's say, that art would normally do. And I think that's, so there is a change. And I think there's definitely like I think now it feels like all the boundaries are kind of morphing. Like the craft world is also getting far more recognition than it would, like even I would say 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, where it's being upheld as what it should be. They are works of art, even if they're made through a craft form, let's say. I think, to do with my own work, you know, we that's always harder to speak of, you know, like what other people see in your work or not, or even, you know, with me, like you just, it's just something you do, you have to do, you know, and I'm not just talking about working for a living, I'm talking about expression, and you know, that there's, I mean, thank goodness I can make a living from what I, you know, love doing. And, you know, like how then it's interpreted. I mean, you know, some people do buy the quilts and put them on the wall. I definitely have quilts, you know, as wall hangings. And, you know, my kind of respect for the textile world is kind of obvious, and yes, it should be very much for me part of that conversation. You know, it's no less of a work.
No, the only reason why I asked was because you know, saying, you know, I'm being regarded as a textile artist, is because, especially that I've got these exhibitions coming up, that I felt it was very important that they are framed and they're behind glass. I really like that idea of, yes, you know, they're textiles, but they're just, you know, they are up there with a painting. You know, I still think sometimes that you know, yes, things are changing, but it's a textile piece. You know, there some people are thinking, oh, it's a textile piece, but bloody hell no, mine are framed. Mine are going to be framed. It's going to cost me a lot of money, but mine are going to be framed under glass, and you know, they are precious to me, and I love them, and I'm going to treat them as I feel they need to be treated. So that they are not lesser than, in my mind. Yeah, even though I feel, you know, I might be a bit of a fraud, but I'm
going to jump in there and draw this part to a close.
Okay.
You know, there's so much more that we could say. So thank you so much to both of you for the conversation so far. We're going to open it up to questions from everyone who's here. So people who are also in the room, if you feel comfortable, this is like the questions from the floor part. And so feel free to turn your camera on if you would like to, so it feels a bit more like we're sitting in a room together a bit. And if you have a question, please post it in the chat and we will ask that on your behalf. So yeah, get thinking of your questions and writing them in the chat. I'll hand over to Carol, who might have something to get us going. You're on mute, Carol.
Because I've been coughing and spluttering. Okay, here's a question from Amy. Is that you, Amy? Oh, right. Gosh. In some of the text excerpts, pattern is discussed in terms of rhythm and action, patterns of movement rather than surface pattern. Sorry. Does this interpretation of pattern speak to you and your work?
I'll jump in and say absolutely. You know, like it's when I'm doing whether it's, let's say, a drawing, it's like yes, there's movement that you have to follow. I have to follow a certain movement, but like in my brain, that rhythm does have to, like, it's almost like I don't want to break that moment, you know. So if I'm doing when I'm placing fabrics, I try to make sure I have enough time to finish it, because I need that rhythm to be you know, like the concentration to go and make flow. And I do feel like in some of the drawings, it's, you know, I see it as, I mean, the best word is rhythm, in a way, even sometimes more than pattern.
Mm.
Mm.
No, I can see how definitely for your work, you know, that's that rhythm, that repeat pattern, which creates that soothing, you know, view, works. For my work, Amy, not so much. More with my stone carving, but not so much with my textile. Not as yet. But you know, so no.
There's a question here from Lindy. Lindy's interested in Marcia talking about putting her textiles under glass. Does this provide the textile work with more status? Does Jessica have a view on this too?
Yes, that's what I want.
Yeah.
That's what I want. Okay. You know, you can see the style of my work and the stitches and have you, but they have, a lot of them have a bit of a bite to them in terms of subject matter. But yes, I want them to have more for me, more than anything. You know, yes, status. Because I say, I'm because the carving and is so much part of my brain as well. I like to put my carvings, I make my own pedestals. I do little tiny, you know, small stylized classical pedestals. And I work, the stone pieces are predominantly about food related, but I will put, I will carve, I've carved a bulb of garlic and I will put it on a pedestal. I give it status. So, and I definitely want that with my textiles. Yes, behind glass, you know, yes, they have they're ladies to be respected. Yes.
Yeah. No, I would definitely agree, and it's reminding me of you know, when my parents had an art gallery in Jamaica, and they worked with a lot of intuitive artists who would just bring rolls of canvases. So their job, Mum and Peter's job, was to frame them, you know, to get them presented in a way where that roll that is tucked under an arm and just come down, you know, like, or with five canvases, you know, with paintings rolled under them. You know, their job was to make it presentable and have status in the gallery, and that would be something that they do to, obviously, yes, for business and whatever, but like, yes, to raise the status of it and make it presentable. I don't necessarily agree that everything needs that frame. I love that you make your own pedestals, because I do think that that's definitely, that would make complete sense to me, how who else could do that for your pieces. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for that being part of the language that they need to, you know, go out into the world.
I mean, the only reason why I want them to, all my work, stone and textile, to have that, even, you know, that oomph, is because I still get a little bit of a feeling that as you know, what is black art? But black art is still well, no, the profile of black art has risen, you know, enormously in the last, you know, a couple of years especially. But as a Black female artist, my work, I want it to be seen, you know, up there, with, you know, a white equivalent. I wanted to have the gravitas be alongside anything else in a museum or a gallery. You know, my work in my head anyway deserves it. So I feel so anyway.
Thank you both. So we've got 4 more questions, 2 for each of you and then 2 for both of you. So first one is from Elaine for Jessica. Marcia mentioned how she uses patterned fabric as shorthand, employing its cultural symbolism. Does Jessica have a take on this for her work?
So when Marcia was speaking about it, I was, you know, like, I guess, not jealous, but like a bit kind of like, yes, that can also bring that much more meaning. And, you know, that is then part of that whole, the story is also through the print and through, you know, so that's like a whole other layer that's being played with. And then I guess, like I have maybe tried to explain that, you know, my pool of fabrics that I work with don't, you know, are basically what, you know, they used 3 years ago to make some dresses. So I, you know, like if I were to do a patchwork piece here, actually make it, then that would be a very different thing. Whereas now my pool of fabrics are, you know, fashion offcuts rather than in choice of, you know, me going to a shop going, okay, this is what I want to use and buying it. That's not my work right now. Obviously, I do have a huge pile of fabrics that, you know, one day will become something. But I mean, I don't have that in my work where, you know, I'm telling that type of story. It is much more to do with the drawing aspect rather than, you know, a story aspect.
But can I just add to that, Jessica, but because you're talking about your current work, but your earlier design work, for example, the Madras check is key in terms of its connection, and it's part of the telling of Jamaica's history. So that was very much part of your design.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I was thinking mainly of the quilts I'm doing now. Then when you brought that up, it also reminded me of the dishcloth dresses that I would do. And, you know, that is definitely like a story within a story.
I love the dishcloth. I love those. They're beautiful.
And then one other thing that maybe we, you know, the free hemming, where all my friends come into the studio and, you know, I'd ask them to hem pieces and they're like, well, I don't know how to sew. And I was like, no, you do. Just follow your rhythm with your stitch. And that's what I want. I don't want you to make it perfect. So we were drawing with stitching as part of a hemming exercise. So, you know, just, you know, like everyone, I mean, yes, if you don't, you know, anyway, it was all about like everybody's own drawing through stitching. So.
And I'm going to add one more thing to that, Jessica, and that was, we included that in the exhibition, Jessica Ogden, still with that long table, which that was your dream, to have this long table and members of the public come in and stitch while the exhibition was open. It was in the shop window. And so that was another, well, how many, was it 75 meters of pattern, of stitching patterns from people from all over. Well, it ended up being people from all over the world, as well as Marcia. Marcia, where do you get your inspiration, and can you explain, in quotes, through the minefield as an example? And that's a question from Amber. Sorry. From Amber.
Favorite minefield. I get, as I think I might have, I said at some point, I listen to a lot of music when I'm carving. in my own workshop. So, and I'm very Catholic in my taste in music. So I could be listening to the Cramps, you know, at one point, or you know, Stevie Wonder next, but a line can come, and just that line, I'll just quickly write it down. For me, again, unlike with my stone carvings, the titles of my pieces are very, very, very important. And the titles sometimes come first, and I'll just sit on them and leave them to percolate in my notebook. And then, but for example, at the moment, what I've got percolating in the back of my brain is I was listening to a CD of the Stranglers, you know, that's the Stranglers, and the line, whatever happened to all of the heroes. So I immediately went heroines, and then a couple of days later, I've been clearly collecting images for there's forgive me, I can't remember the name, the Black females, Edmona Wildfire Lewis. She is my absolute, she's a stone carver from the 18th century, yes, 19th century. And there's a guitarist who, she was basically, you know, classed as the godmother of rock and roll. Forgive me, my names have gone completely out of my head. So there are these women who suddenly I've been collecting, and I'm thinking of doing, I don't know if I want to do them all in one piece, like, you know, next to each other, her with her guitar, the other one on her motorbike going across, you know, or as a series. So as I might, as Amy introduced me, I do women from history as well as my own personal pieces, and it also depends what's going on with me, you know. So any personal stuff, you know, I say it does come out. But so music and history are very dominant at the moment. That's my inspiration. Yes, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions coming through now, so we're going to have to ask for short answers from you two, if possible.
Sorry, raising
So no. So from Asley, sorry, I'm sorry, but my eyesight. I'm interested in what do you think about commodification of textile arts? Is it in danger of losing its voice, or if making it mainstream could make it also more accessible? And that's to both of you, I beg your pardon, to both of you.
Jessica?
I'm not sure if I fully understood, just about textile arts becoming more mainstream, and is that a good thing? Is that the general, yeah?
I think that's the general thing, yes.
I mean, I guess what I would say is it's great that it's becoming, you know, more, let's say, I don't know if I'd use the word mainstream, but, you know, sewing is important. And, you know, that, you know, the more that we have, you know, like, the more we teach people how to sew, the better life will be. Sorry, that sounds really weird, but it's, you know, it's such a basic skill, and it's so useful as well as magical. So
for me, the commodification, I want textiles to be, well, I wouldn't I? You know, to be seen right up there. Yeah, why not? You know, right up there with paintings and sculpture, and people not batting an eyelid about, you know, going into a gallery or a museum with you know, textile pieces. Yes, I want it. I want Joe Public to not be looking at it still looking at it as an all-female thing that, you know, we do in sewing circles, you know, over tea, you know, so no, yeah, get it out there.
And this is a question from CW for Jessica. How would you relate your sailor stripes to your perspective on pattern?
I would say they're very much all part of it, a bit like, you know, we just talked about free hemming. You know, like it's all, I guess, a form of drawing, and that, you know, for me, then how, you know, it's, you know, I'm conscious I wore stripes today on top of that, you know, that was also part of the play of, you know, that it's, you know, I guess that's what what thrills me is, you know, like playing with all of these surfaces and, you know, the different depths. So yeah, sailor stripes are definitely part of my pattern making world.
Thank you. And this is a question from Izzy for Marcia. Marcia, do you use your textiles and stone sculpture to express similar ideas and themes, or do you find the differing processes and materials work to express, in brackets, vastly, close brackets, different things?
Oh, very, very different, very, very different. I have been working on, I'm working on at the moment for a stone exhibition. This fictional, you know, civilization called the Lost Royals. So I am depicting people, men and women. Basically, it's my version of the Green Man. I didn't realize that the Green Man went right across all countries and all cultures over history. You know, I just heard about it as a little, you know, little English thing. So, in that respect, yes, I'm. That's where I'm doing sometimes fictional fantasy characters or people from history sometimes, but my textiles are yes, very, you know, cathartic. They're very personal. A lot of you know, therapy, you know, it's, you know, comes out of as a result. My stone carving is very soothing when I'm doing my own work. But the subject matter, my subject matter is for stone is predominantly food. It's all one way or the other culinary related, whereas my textiles are yeah, more, yes, not. You can tell I'm an artist, can't you? Cut two words together.
So it's now 4:31. I'm going to do something strange. There's a comment from Azadar, not a question, and then there's a question from Elaine, but I'm going to make it a comment, something that you can mull over and maybe answer later. So first, Azadar, not a question. Thank you so much. This is from Marcia. Thank you so much for this brilliant conversation. I'm a PhD student from Toronto, Canada, and I'm using secondhand textiles in art-based research. Marcia, your work is a total inspiration and one that I also want to further discuss with students as well. I think students need strong examples of artists of color who are proud of the work they create. And I do agree that your textile works deserve to be protected under glass. And while Elaine says, it was a question, but we just haven't got the time, but I wanted to relate this. It seems that both Marcia and Jessica both layer pattern to create a cacophony, polyphonic effect in terms of the rhythm of pattern, not always soothing, but also clashing and interrogating each other, in brackets, looking at the work behind Jessica, close brackets. And over to you, Amy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. good to leave us with more stuff still to
Yes.
think about, a reflection on a really rich conversation. So yes, it's time to draw this to a close. Thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to Elise, who has made everything work behind the scenes. A big thank you to Marcia and Jessica for such a brilliant discussion. We're going to be rounding the series off with our reflective stitching, which is a very exciting in-person event, one of those rare beasts, on Wednesday afternoon at Chelsea College of Art. So yeah, we look forward to doing that if you're able to join us. If not, it will be filmed and the video will be made available later with the recordings of the 3 conversations as well. So you'll be able to catch up if you're not able to join us in person. I think that's all. So yeah, thank you everybody.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to see you all and have this conversation. Great.
Well, thank you for making it a lot easier than I anticipated.
You too.
It was very soon. So thank you, Carol, Jessica, Amy. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Jessica and Marcia and Amy, and also Elise.
Oh yes, and Elise. Yes.
Background.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Okay.
Bye everybody.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.